Imagine a valley where the fog clings to the trees like a shroud, and silence is never just silence. It is memory. It is accusation. It is the weight of something unsaid. The Appalachian hills hold many stories, but few are as infamous or as unsettling as the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. For more than a century, their name has been a byword for family rivalry, vengeance, and blood spilled on the soil of Kentucky and West Virginia. Yet beneath the familiar tale of gunfights and vendettas lies a deeper, darker question: what else was hidden in those hills? The feud is often remembered as a violent quarrel over politics, land, and pride. But step closer and the story begins to blur. What if the Hatfields and McCoys weren't just fighting each other? What if the battle masked something far more disturbing, a shadow within their own families, whispered about but never spoken aloud? Travelers who passed through the region spoke of children who looked too similar, of generations who rarely married outside their kin. In a world so isolated that outsiders were treated with suspicion, bloodlines ran close, sometimes too close. And in those tight circles, silence was as dangerous as the gunfire. It protected secrets, and secrets, in turn, bred fear. This is not a story told in bright daylight. It is a story that lingers in the hollers at dusk, when the sound of a whippoorwill carries like a warning through the trees. It is the story of a feud remembered for its bullets, but haunted by something that may have been far older and far more difficult to kill. Tonight, we walk back into that silence, into the cabins where shutters were drawn tight against the night, into the churchyards where stones carry names repeated too many times across generations, into the bloodline itself where the line between kinship and curse begins to blur. The Hatfields and the McCoys were not just two families at war. They may have been families at war with themselves, and what they carried in their veins may be the darkest part of all. The feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys did not erupt in a vacuum. To understand its shadows, we need to step into the world of the late 19th century, into the Appalachian Mountains, a place at once breathtaking in beauty and suffocating in isolation. The mountains themselves were both protector and prison. Roads were scarce, rivers ran wild, and valleys were carved deep into the earth. Families clung to the ridges, farming patches of stubborn soil, raising hogs and cutting timber where they could. Life here was raw, hard, and fiercely insular. Outsiders rarely came, and when they did, they were met with suspicion. In such a closed world, family was everything. Blood was both bond and survival. The Hatfields and McCoys were not faceless clans. They were real people whose lives were intertwined with the land. The Hatfields lived primarily on the West Virginia side of the Tug Fork River, led by William Anderson Devil Anse Hatfield, a man feared as much as he was respected. Across the water in Kentucky stood Randolph Randall McCoy, a patriarch hardened by loss and grief. Their families were large, their roots deep, and their tempers legendary. The Civil War had scarred the region just years before. Loyalties were divided, neighbors turned enemies, and the Hatfields and McCoys found themselves on opposing sides. Wounds from the war did not heal easily. Instead, they lingered, fusing into old grudges. By the 1870s, when the feud began in earnest, the soil of Appalachia was already stained with betrayal. But the conflict was never just about politics or a stolen hog, as some stories suggest. It was about pride, reputation, and the fragile balance of honor in a place where law was distant and justice was often taken into one's own hands. A slighted word, a boundary crossed, could spiral into bloodshed. And once blood was spilled, it demanded more. Still, even as the feud's violence echoed through the valleys, whispers suggested something else lurked beneath.
Travelers and court records spoke of insular marriages, of families who married cousin to cousin, generation after generation. In a land where outsiders were distrusted and where poverty left little room for choice, bloodlines began to knot in ways that carried consequences. Children were sometimes born with frailties, with features that drew quiet stares. But the silence was stronger than curiosity. In Appalachia, what happened within the family stayed there, buried like roots beneath the soil. By the time the first shots of the feud rang out, the Hatfields and McCoys were already legends in their own valleys. Their names carried weight, their grudges carried danger. Yet perhaps the most dangerous thing of all was not the feud itself, but what was left unspoken behind cabin doors. The stage was set. Two powerful families, bound by pride, torn apart by war, and surrounded by secrets too dangerous to name. The feud would soon ignite into a storm of violence. But beneath the gunfire, another legacy lingered, waiting for those willing to look closer.
What, then, was the real heart of the Hatfield-McCoy tragedy? On the surface, history tells us of feuds sparked by stolen livestock, contested timber rights, and election day brawls that turned deadly. But those explanations feel strangely hollow. Could one pig, one insult, or even one battlefield rivalry really ignite decades of bloodshed that left dozens dead and entire families haunted? The deeper one looks, the more unsettling the questions become. Behind the gun smoke and the court trials lies something rarely spoken of: the insularity of these mountain families. Outsiders noticed it even then. Strangers who dared travel into Tug Valley described a population bound by kinship so tight that cousins often became husbands and wives. Survival in the mountains demanded loyalty, and loyalty often meant turning inward. In such conditions, bloodlines intertwined until the family tree resembled a knot rather than a branching oak. Whispers suggested this closeness left marks: children born with unusual frailties or minds clouded by unexplained illnesses. Doctors in nearby towns sometimes hinted at hereditary weakness, but rarely said more. In a land already mocked as backward by the outside world, admitting to such shadows risked humiliation. So, the whispers remained whispers. The silence grew thicker than the mountain fog. The feud itself seemed to feed on that silence. Once violence began, it escalated in ways that defied reason. Hatfields and McCoys killed not just out of vengeance, but almost ritualistically, as though the feud itself demanded blood offerings. Was this simply human rage left unchecked? Or had years of secrecy, shame, and isolation twisted their sense of justice into something darker? Court records tell of brutal ambushes, houses set ablaze in the dead of night, men and boys cut down without mercy. But local folklore adds another layer. Some old-timers spoke of bad blood in Tug Valley, not just metaphorically, but literally, a curse that ran through generations. Families feuded not only with bullets, but with their own bloodlines, carrying scars invisible to outsiders. The mystery is not whether the Hatfields and McCoys happened. We know it did. But why it became so relentless? Why did no truce hold, no peace last? Why did the violence feel inevitable, almost fated? The answer may lie less in the details of stolen hogs or election day violence, and more in the shadow of something Appalachia itself refused to name. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: were the Hatfields and McCoys fighting each other, or were they also, in some unspoken way, fighting the consequences of their own hidden bloodlines? Night falls differently in the Tug Valley. The mountains seem to swallow the last light, leaving shadows thick enough to suffocate. It was under these skies that the feud between the Hatfields and McCoys reached its darkest hour. By then, the hatred was no longer confined to men with rifles. It seeped into children, mothers, even preachers, until the valley itself seemed cursed. The trigger was often small, a rumor of betrayal, an insult whispered at a church gathering, a glance that lingered too long. But when the guns were drawn, the violence was merciless. One of the most infamous moments came on New Year's Day, 1888, when a band of Hatfields descended on the McCoy homestead. It was a night of fire and screams. The cabin erupted in flames while bullets tore through the cold air. 2 of Randolph McCoy's children were murdered before dawn, their bodies left in the snow like broken dolls. Randolph himself barely escaped. The attack was meant to end the feud once and for all, but it only drenched the valley in deeper blood. Witnesses remembered the horror not just for its brutality, but for its silence. The attackers spoke little, their faces blank in the flicker of burning timber. Neighbors claimed it was as if the violence had become mechanical, a ritual carried out without passion. That absence of emotion frightened them more than rage could. It was as though something inhuman had taken root in the Hatfields and McCoys alike, driving them forward with dead-eyed purpose. The courts finally intervened, dragging family members into trials that resembled theater as much as justice. Devil Anse himself stood as a symbol, his name alone feeding the legend of a man who carried something darker than pride in his veins. Some saw him as a demon in human form, his eyes cold as stone, even while his kin faced the gallows. Others whispered that Devil Anse was not the true villain, but a vessel of the valley's old curse, the bad blood no one dared name aloud. At the climax of the feud, Tug Valley became less a community than a haunted battlefield. Families locked themselves indoors at night, listening for the sound of boots crunching on gravel, the low creak of a door hinge, the gunshot that would shatter their world. Children grew up with the smell of gunpowder in their lungs, mothers burying sons before they reached manhood. And yet, beneath the bloodshed lay something more grotesque. The uncanny sense that the feud could not end, that it was repeating itself in patterns older than memory. Hatfields killed McCoys. McCoys killed Hatfields, each act answered by another, like an echo trapped in the hollows of the mountains. It was vengeance without horizon, a circle carved into the very marrow of these families. Local folklore deepened the horror. Old mountain women muttered that the feud was not entirely of human making. They spoke of children born wrong, with pale, uneven faces, wide, staring eyes, and strange fits of rage. Some claimed these were the signs of bloodlines wound too tightly, the curse of families who married within their own shadows. Were these just cruel rumors, born from gossip and fear? Or did the feud conceal a darker truth, that the violence was both cause and consequence of a hidden sickness, carried in blood as much as in memory? By the time the feud began to fade, it had already devoured a generation. Dozens were dead. Others carried scars that would never heal, physical and otherwise. What lingered was not peace, but exhaustion. The survivors spoke little. The silence, once again, became the valley's defining sound. And silence is its own kind of horror. The climax of the Hatfield-McCoy feud was not just the burning cabins, the hangings, or the trials. It was the transformation of ordinary mountain families into specters of vengeance, trapped in a cycle no one seemed able to break. To this day, the shadow of that violence clings to Tug Valley, as though the earth itself remembers every drop of blood spilled into its soil.
When the last shots finally echoed into silence, Tug Valley was left with scars that reached far deeper than the graves dug into its soil. The feud between the Hatfields and McCoys had not only stolen lives, it had disfigured the very fabric of the community. Families who once worshipped in the same wooden churches could no longer sit under one roof. Children grew up with their surnames as burdens, carrying a legacy of fear and suspicion wherever they went. The courts had their verdicts, the newspapers had their stories, and the rest of America had its grotesque fascination with hillbilly justice. To outsiders, the feud became entertainment, a sensational tale of primitive mountain folk locked in endless violence. Plays, novels, and eventually films would caricature the families as comic relics of Appalachian backwardness. But beneath the ridicule lay the quieter truth. Real children had died in their beds, real men had been lynched, and entire households had lived years on end under the constant threat of annihilation. For the Hatfields and McCoys themselves, the feud left a kind of silence that was heavier than gunfire. Survivors carried their grief privately, often refusing to speak of what had happened. Generations later, descendants would describe a childhood where the past was present only as whispers, warnings, or the occasional hard stare from an elder who had lost too much to forgive. Forgiveness, in fact, became its own rare currency in Tug Valley, spoken of in theory, but seldom practiced. Beyond the families, the feud hardened how Appalachia was perceived. The violence was seized upon as proof of the region's supposed savagery, fueling stereotypes that would shadow Appalachians for more than a century. Politicians, journalists, and social reformers pointed to the Hatfields and McCoys as cautionary figures, their feud a symbol of what happened when isolation bred ignorance and lawlessness. In this way, the feud became not just a private tragedy, but a public stain. Yet for all the ridicule, something darker lingered. Rumors of bad blood persisted, muttering about hidden deformities, strange tempers, and children born too familiar in the face. The idea that the violence was not only cultural, but hereditary haunted the valley. Were the Hatfields and McCoys victims of circumstance, or of something inscribed in their very lineage? Such speculation blurred the line between history and horror, turning the feud into both a cautionary tale and a ghost story. By the turn of the 20th century, the feud's violence had subsided, but its consequences endured. Poverty still clung to the region. Families still bore grudges that echoed down generations. And above all, the name itself, Hatfield or McCoy, remained a weight, heavy with expectations, judgments, and whispered fears. The consequences, then, were not only blood spilled, but blood remembered. The Tug Valley carried its past like a shadow, and perhaps it always will.
The hills of Tug Valley are quiet now. The creeks run the same course, the ridges rise as they always have, and the names Hatfield and McCoy are carved not only into gravestones, but into the collective memory of America. Yet when the wind drifts through the hollers at dusk, it carries an unease, as if the soil itself remembers. In many ways, the feud has outlived the families. It has become folklore, a shorthand for endless conflict, invoked whenever bitterness refuses to die. But stripped of legend, what remains is not just a story of gunfights and revenge. It is a study in silence, in how pain festers when no one dares to speak, and how grudges can calcify until they feel like destiny. There is something unsettling about how easily violence becomes inheritance. Children were born into this feud, carrying a burden before they could speak their own names. The tragedy of the Hatfields and McCoys is not simply that so many died, but that so many lived with the shadow of hate pressed against their lives. And so the question lingers, was the feud ever truly about land or politics, or was it about something deeper, something buried within the bloodlines themselves? We may never know. The truth lies tangled in folklore and silence in the graves of those who will never tell their side. What we are left with, then, is a mirror. The story of the Hatfields and McCoys reflects not only their violence, but the darker corners of human nature, our ability to inherit anger, to pass down silence, to turn family into fate. It is not only their curse, it could be ours, too.